Thanks for having me, Chris. As you said before, this paper is largely based on a chapter of my thesis on Halford Mackinder, and some parts of it have already been presented at the annual conference of the British International History Group in last September during the annual conference in Leicester of that association. So, as you can see from the picture here, tonight I'll talk about international relations, but not from a diplomatic point of view, but instead from an intellectual point of view. Indeed, I will talk about ideas of inter-allied cooperation, empire, economic development, international reconstruction, democracy, small and big nations, and the relationship between these two groups of different nations. Last but not least, the focus of this paper will be different from that of the previous papers in the Legacies of War series, because while Christina Robert and Bob Thompson focus more on the Western Front, seen as the main seat of social and organizational change during the war, my focus will be instead global. I'll talk about the First World War as a global war, due not only to the various military fronts where it was fought, but also due to the huge economic, cultural, and political implications of the conflict around the globe. And I'll talk globally about the war because it was on global terms that Mackinder viewed the conflict, adapting his geopolitical thought and his political reflection to the changing circumstances of the time. But first of all, just to introduce you to the main subject of this paper, let's talk a little bit about Mackinder. Mackinder was a prominent educational reformer during the Edwardian era. He may be considered as the father of modern British geography due to his constant activism in support of the discipline in the 1890s and early 1900s. He founded the School of Geography in Oxford in 1899. He climbed Mount Kenya in the same year, becoming one of the last explorers of Africa in the late 19th century. And in 1903 he joined the main ranks of the tariff reform movement led by Joseph Chamberlain, fighting relentlessly for the establishment of a system of imperial preference between Britain and the Dominions. He was also director of the LSE from 1903 to 1908, and he contributed to the final establishment of the school as a main educational institution in London. Introduced the new subjects like sociology, for example, and during that same period of time, he became involved in the activities of the so-called Mackinder Garden, this military school designed by him and Richard Haldane, the Secretary of State in the Asquith government, designed for the education of military officers and for the modernization of military knowledge in the army. The school lasted for around 30 years. It was only closed in the early 1930s, and they contributed to the formation of several officers of the British Army who later played a small or big role in the British war effort during the First World War. Of course, Mackinder was an ambitious man, so he was not satisfied by all these accomplishments, and in 1908 he left the direction of the LSE, and he tried to gain a seat in Parliament. 2 years later, in 1910, he won the seat of Kamlaki, a constituency in the Glasgow area, and he remained in Parliament for all the length of the World War, losing his seat only in 1922 after the fall of the Lloyd George coalition government. After the war, he was also involved in diplomacy, in the diplomacy of European reconstruction. He was selected by Lord Curzon as British High Commissioner to South Russia, and he was sent in the winter of 1919-1920 to the headquarters of General Denikin in South Russia, with the aim to keep up the fight of Denikin's forces against the Bolsheviks. The mission went completely wrong. Mackinder could not save the situation in South Russia, and his imaginative scheme of a big coalition of local East European states forming a sort of cordon sanitaire around the Soviet forces failed to impress the cabinet, compelling him to resign only a few weeks after his return to London in 1920. However, his political life was not closed at that point, because in 1922 he became chairman of the Imperial Shaping Committee, this organization composed by British and Dominion representatives interested in the development and recovery of imperial shipping after the war. And in that position, he was quite successful. His services were appreciated both by the British government and by the Dominion governments, and he lasted as chairman of the committee for almost 20 years, living only on the eve of World War II. However, despite all these achievements, all these activities, Mackinder today is not remembered for these things, but he is instead remembered for the geographical pivot of history. This address delivered at the Royal Geographical Society in 1904, where through a complex geographical and historical analysis, he presented this particular area of Asia between the Arctic Ocean and India as the geographical center of world history. Due to its central strategic position, and to the historical experience of the Mongols and other nomadic empires developed from that area. The paper was not successful at the time, and it was only rediscovered as a central geopolitical theory in the interwar period. First of all, by General Haushofer and his geopolitical school in Munich, and Haushofer redesigned this theory in support of German revisionism against the settlement established by the Paris Peace Conference. And during the war, Haushofer and his geopolitical ideas were considered, especially in the United States, at the basis of Hitler's aggressive foreign policy against the Western powers and the Soviet Union. However, despite all the public condemnation of German geopolitics and the interpretation given by Haushofer to Mackinder's theory, American strategists used the same kind of theory in the Cold War era to put in place their containment strategy against the Soviet Union. And today, Mackinder is still remembered as the main inspirer as one of the main inspirers of the containment strategies of the United States during the Cold War. Generally, strategists and geopolitical scholars see the Heartland theory as a piece of eternal strategic truth, as something that it is deeply rooted in the physical and strategic characteristics of the Eurasian landmass. However, the theory developed by Mackinder was not something static, something monolithic. It was something that changed during time, and you can see that from this image, where you can notice the changing borders of the area identified by Mackinder as the geographical pivot of history. In 1904, The area covered only Siberia, Central Asia, and some area of Persia. 15 years later, in 1919, Mackinder revised this theory and he moved the borders of the Heartland area to the west, including all Eastern Europe and part of northern Turkey. Again, in 1943, Mackinder revised another time his theory and he moved again the border of the Heartland theory. In this case, he withdrew the area to the west, leaving out some parts of China and Siberia. Of course, these changes may appear merely cosmetic, the product of changing strategic circumstances and changing political situations. Of course, the inclusion of Eastern Europe and Northern Turkey in 1919 may be explained by the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and by the disintegration of Austria-Hungary and the significant reduction of German power in Europe. However, what I want to underline in my thesis is that these changes were deeper and more significant than generally accepted. In a certain sense, the borders of the Heartland theory were only a minor change in Mackinder's geopolitical reflection and in the changes supported by Mackinder through this reflection throughout the years. If we look in this sense to the philosophical and political outlook presented by Mackinder in the pivot paper of 1904 and in the revision of 1919, the differences are quite striking. In 1904, Mackinder presented the world as a closed space system due to the exhaustion of undiscovered lands around the world. He said that there were no more places open to colonization and the creation of new imperial outposts across the world. At the same time, he observed that free trade, who had been the main economic ideology of the 19th century, was on the wane, replaced by strong protectionist measures both in America and in Europe and in Asia. And this was probably the cardinal point of his theory in 1904. He underlined the fact that big empires, especially big continental empires, were destined to be the main actors of future international life. There was no place for small nations. They were instead destined to be absorbed by these empires and to become part of this struggle between opposed political and economic blocs. From this point of view, he also remarked the disadvantageous position of Britain in the context of the time. Britain, who still relied on free trade as its main economic ideology, as its main economic policy. And at the same time, Britain, which was the core of an empire not united, not compact, but a scattered empire across the different parts of the world. An empire which appeared extremely fragile compared to the new compact and continental rivals present on the Eurasian landmass, especially Russia and Germany. Last but not least, the paper of 1904 was all based on a strict idea of environmental determinism. For Mackinder, geography was destiny, and nations, the role occupied by different nations in the international system was designed and determined by their geographical position. So, from this point of view, he wanted to shake up Britain, to move on Britain and convince it of the importance of its geographical position on the Atlantic Ocean. And at the same time, he wanted to create a solid block between Britain and the Dominions, creating a compact empire capable to deal with the new continental rivals of the early 20th century. 15 years later, when Mackinder revised this theory in Democratic Ideas and Reality, which is still considered his masterpiece today, the Heartland theory knew significant changes. It not only extended to Eastern Europe, but it was also surrounded by change ideas, by change beliefs on the part of Mackinder. For example, Democratic Ideas and Reality is full of statement. Is full of doubtful statements about the efficacy of protectionism as an economic ideology. Mackinder, the staunch tariff reformer, who in the pre-war era had campaigned relentlessly for the union of Britain with the Dominions through a system of imperial preference, suddenly lost faith in this solution. He thought that it was not useful. It was even dangerous because it contributed to the exasperation of international tensions. At the same time, and this is probably the most interesting change in his vision, he moved away from his belief that the international system was destined to be an arena of big empires, of big nations. On the contrary, he began to defend the value of small states, the value of small communities. He proposed the reconstruction of nations on provincial basis, creating a system which was fair and which was able to resist to the pressures of modern international life. At the same time, his tones became less deterministic. Geography was no more destiny. Geography could be transcended somehow, some way. It was a duty of men to transcend the geographical dimension of their existence and to create a better and more stable international environment. Finally, as a sort of culmination of this revision, he embraced the idea of the League of Nations. His acceptance of the League was never enthusiastic, but he accepted it as a sort of minor evil, as a sort of positive element which refounded on a stronger basis could secure peace and stability to the world. Of course, all these changes were the product of Mackinder's experience during the war. But what exactly happened during the war? Why did Mackinder arrive to these change conclusions in 1919? Well, we should start in our analysis of the impact of the war on Mackinder. We should start from his memory of the war, which was expressed firstly in 1935, when British cinemas were invaded by the Royal Cavalcade, a long documentary on the life and times of King George V, who was then celebrating the silver jubilee of his ascent to the throne in 1910. Missing reenactment in original newsreel, the movie presented all the various phases of the King's reign, including the Great War and the recent economic depression, and depicted an intense, dramatic picture of British national life in the first decades of the 20th century. The press was generally sympathetic toward the operation, praising the bold and cheerful reconstruction of events that the camera recorded. But not all members of the public were convinced by such a colorful interpretation of the recent national past. Sir Albion Richardson, a former Liberal MP, lamented the inaccurate depiction of the World War, finding especially disturbing the scenes in the movie of wild enthusiasm representing the official declaration of war with Germany in August 1914, especially the scenes of wild enthusiasm in Parliament at Westminster. He wrote to the Times, "No one who, like myself, was present on that afternoon is ever likely to forget what happened. Sir Edward Grey's statement was listened with tense emotion and in silence. There were no cheers in the House of Commons as the curtain rose upon the most poignant tragedy in history." Some days later, Mackinder intervened in the discussion, presenting a memory of the event of presenting a memory of that event, the declaration of war to Germany in the House of Commons, very similar to that of Richardson and full of solemn and quasi-religious tones. He wrote, "As the House rose on August 4th, 1914, we all stood, and led by a much-liked member of the Labour Party, we sang the national anthem. It was sung in the same solemn spirit which had characterized our proceedings on these two historic days. A great hymn, certainly not of hate, but of submission to fate and of national unity." Of course, this kind of austere memory of the war may seem a temporary outburst of aesthetic formality, designed to embellish the memory of a dramatic past and to justify the fateful decisions taken by the British Parliament in the summer of 1914. However, I think that this is only part of the truth. The grave and tragic tones of this memory of the outbreak of war in 1914 is also probably rooted in the direct experience of those turbulent years, in the unprecedented levels of political and personal stress experienced by Mackinder during the war. Indeed, as the other members of Parliament and the leading exponents of the war cabinet, he had to face, in the period 1914-1918, a series of complex challenges related to a long and destructive international conflict, spreading from the fields of Flanders to the deserts of the Middle East. Supporting with his rhetoric or with his parliamentary vote harsh economic policies and unpopular military decisions. Moreover, he had constantly to justify his position in front of the electorate, paying constant visits to his constituency, defying unpatriotic agitators, and trying to gain renewed support for the national war effort. Finally, like many other politicians and public figures of the time, he did not escape the terrible human cost of the war, losing friends and students in the daily carnage on the various war fronts. Indeed, he witnessed the sudden destruction of that young generation of new geographers which, as an energetic educational reformer, he had carefully prepared at Oxford and at the LSE during the early years of the 20th century. As he gloomily observed in 1916, it is obvious that in the tremendous stirring of souls, which is the result of this war context, traditions and convictions have inevitably been broken as never since the time of the Civil War. At Oxford and Cambridge we have had very nearly a complete break in undergraduate tradition. If the war continues over the beginning of one more academic year, we shall have to register the fact that for the first time since the days when the king kept court at Oxford, undergraduate tradition will have been completely broken at Oxford and Cambridge. How far that tradition can be refounded is a moot point. How did he react to this situation, to the destruction of part of the legacy of his educational life? Well, he threw himself into a remarkable series of parliamentary and extra-parliamentary activities designed to maintain national sanity and justified optimism deemed essential to the survival of the British Empire in that fateful international crisis. Thus, in a certain sense, the Great War represented the most vibrant phase of his political intellectual career, strengthening his previous beliefs in support of economic reform and imperial unity. At the same time, however, Mackinder's fiery patriotic vision knew some sort of critical reassessment, thanks mainly to the involvement with democratic groups like the New Europe, the Serbian Society, and the allied parliaments. The liberal spirit of these organizations, firmly committed to the emancipation of European peoples from the authoritarian rule of the Central Powers, partially influenced his geopolitical reflection of the time, reviving some aspects of his young liberal upbringing, because he has started as a liberal his political career in the early 1900s, before passing with Chamberlain in 1903. When the presidential struggle ended in 1918, leaving the world irretrievably shaken, Mackinder was then quite different from the nationalist agitator of the pre-war years, showing a more moderate stance both on domestic and international issues. As he plainly declared in the late 1920s, the world had completely changed since the dramatic summer of 1914, compelling people to put away the ideas of the day before yesterday and try to see things merely in the present, following the natural trend of a new marvelous age of global communications. Therefore, the solemn memory of the Great War in 1945 has some genuine foundations, rooted in the unique atmosphere of those dramatic years. Ironically, his involvement in the war effort was initially not particularly exceptional. It was mainly focused on the recruitment of Scottish volunteers for the new army raised by Lord Kitchener in the autumn of 1914. The recruiting campaign, however, seemed to fulfill the patriotic and reformist attitude of his pre-war political career, discarding the all-free trade complacency of liberal England in favor of a new mixture of economic frugality and imperial solidarity. In Scotland, for example, recruitment was extremely successful, providing more than 200,000 volunteers prior to the Military Services Act of 1916. And popular patriotism allowed the Conservative Party to regain internal unity and electoral appeal with the business community. Thus, the first years of the conflict gave fresh impetus to Mackinder's political beliefs, putting them in service of a major national emergency. By the end of 1915, he was fully aware of the urgency of a drastic change in public economic attitudes as a solution to the increasing shortage of men and materials provoked by the attrition struggle on the Western Front. He declared in November 1915, "Now we are suddenly faced with the greater problem of total production and total consumption of the nation, because it is the difference between consumption and production that gives what I call your war fund. The more you can reduce consumption, the more you can increase production. The more you can practice these inverse processes, the wider will become the margin." This, according to him, was the only way to stay on the same path of Germany, thinking no more in pounds, shillings, and pence, but instead in actual human service to the nation, maintaining the delicate balance of power between the fighting section and the producing section of the country. Speaking after the inconclusive bloodshed of the first two battles of Ypres, which had virtually annihilated the pre-war regular army and thousands of Kitchener's young volunteers, Mackinder knew that the old voluntary system was unable to cope with the exuberant request of the War Office without endangering the entire economic structure of the United Kingdom. Indeed, the only solution to the paucity of new recruits was conscription, something destined to provoke serious fractures in British society, dismantling the original patriotic union of August 1914. At the same time, he believed that the introduction of coercive measures by the government could also infringe the democratic rights of all the citizens, pushing the country toward Prussianism or other forms of continental authoritarianism. Therefore, he proposed to involve directly the population in the war effort through education and public confidence, marshalling the massive resources of the empire in an effective and unrestrained way. He declared again in November 1915, "You must appeal to the democracy. Our democracy is intelligent, and if a thing is put before them with sufficient authority, clearness, and with power, such as possessed by the Minister of Munitions, if the matter is seriously taken up by one of our great leaders, and it is done by way of campaign, you may possibly produce some understanding of this question in the country, because it is not intelligence which is wanted among the people, but a clear statement of facts. Recruiting and munition work are important, but a third work of equal importance is to imbue the community with a clear perception of the necessity for economy. If you are not to resort to rationing or dragooning or Prussian methods, you can only have recourse to the pure democratic method of government, namely education." On the surface, this suggestion appears simply to restate the patriotic tones of Joseph Chamberlain's pre-war fiscal campaign, asking for some sort of conscious sacrifice in the name of the empire. But its key preoccupation with democracy represented a new note in Mackinder's political reflection, aimed to reconcile his own liberal values with the unrelenting pursuit of national efficiency. To be true, such democratic instinct had never disappeared from his intellectual horizon in the antebellum era. In the spring of 1914, for example, he proudly described Britain as an industrial democracy increasingly based on education, seen as essential for rule and especially for the rule of an empire. but it remained more or less obscured by other economic and social concerns, which stressed the importance of power and organization over freedom and civil liberties. In this sense, the German political model, with its constant call for national unity and social organism, represented a positive counterpoint to the decrepitude of liberal England, showing the huge potentialities of a modern industrial state in the 20th century. However, with the outbreak of the war, that model became embarrassing at best or barbaric at worst, submerged by the hatred and indignation generated by the war. As other British intellectuals of the time, in fact, Mackinder had to face the feeling of betrayal and broken fellowship toward German culture caused by the invasion of Belgium and the sinking of the Lusitania, which contributed to nurture violent anti-German feelings across the British Empire. Even his old friend Michael Sadler, who had praised the modernity of German higher education in 1906, rejected his previous beliefs on the matter, claiming that the long and admirable mental discipline of German scholars had been perverted into blind and destructive partisanship, neglecting the duty of disinterested reflection at the core of true scientific progress in the world. The same opinion was held by another of Mackinder's academic colleagues, William Ewins, the famous economist, who remarked the dangerous similarity of German wartime resolutions designed to create a self-sufficient empire in Central Europe with those entertained by the tariff reform movement before the conflict. Previously admired, this kind of closed economic system now appeared as completely opposed to the genius of the British Empire, made by the peaceful coexistence of different states and societies around the world, and it needed to be resisted jointly by Britain and its allies, building up a balanced commercial network centered on the resources of the British colonies. Thus, what was admirable in the pre-war era, including the refined protectionist theories of Friedrich List or the philosophical notions of German geographers like Friedrich Ratzel, now represented instead an evil and perverse threat to international peace and national prosperity, requiring an alternative proposal to these plans of conquest and despotism. And Mackinder struggled in search of this alternative throughout the war, trying to find a new synthesis for his divergent political ideals. This effort concerned both domestic and international issues, revealing often persistent tensions or contradictions in his evolving thought. On the domestic side, he continued to see business-like machinery as essential for the efficiency of a democratic society, dealing promptly with the needs of the nation. But he distrusted the new coalition government led by Asquith, fearing the erosion of parliamentary rights and the loss of contact with popular feelings. He claimed in 1915, "I think that when the coalition government has been in power for a time, it will grow increasingly out of touch with the nation, unless somehow or other we in this House of Commons evolve something in the nature of a representative group of men who will be able to voice not merely the views, very important views of this and that section, but also to give utterance to the general pervading opinion of the House in criticism of the government." In this sense, the legislative power at Westminster required a proper and thorough reform, avoiding the partisan clashes of the last years of the pre-war period, especially the crucial role of the House of Lords. Indeed, Mackinder thought that a sufficiently strong second chamber, founded upon a sufficiently democratic basis, represented a fundamental part of an enduring freedom in the difficult times of reconstruction following the end of the war. However, as a committed anti-suffragist, he continued to refuse the inclusion of women in this renovated parliamentary system, remaining loyal to his previous convictions and signing a vigorous public appeal against any further extension of the suffrage to the female community in the autumn of 1916. This one. Signed by arch-imperialists like Curzon, Cromer and Kipling, the document promised in fact the most strenuous opposition to any future legislation in favor of women's suffrage, claiming that the recent circumstances of the war, with thousands of women replacing men in vital industrial sectors and public services, were not enough to justify any serious modification of the pre-war electoral system. This uncompromising statement provoked the firm response of a wide group of suffragists, including prominent members of the Conservative Party like Lord Selborne and Willoughby de Brock, who condemned the position of Mackinder and company, warning that if the British franchise had to be remodeled at the end of the conflict, it would have been a very grave injustice to women, their possible exclusion from the reformed political life of the nation. Some days later, Beatrice Webb, Margaret Ashton, and other female reformers reiterated these calls for equity, underlining the crucial role played by women in the British war effort. In reality, Mackinder recognized the importance of women for the maintenance of economic efficiency during the conflict, providing an excellent replacement to the men enrolled to the front. But this transformation failed to impress a significant change to a masculine view of political activities, which continued to divide separate spheres of action for the two sexes in British public life. As an old member of the Anti-Suffrage League, he was ready to submit the thorny question of women's suffrage to a referendum, but only after a clear warning given by a responsible statesman to the electors on the matter. This certainly represented a serious contradiction to his idea of a British intelligent democracy opposed to the autocratic methods of the Central Powers. On the economic side, Mackinder remained substantially loyal to his pre-war ideas, insisting on the primacy of industrial capital over financial resources for the conduct of the war. Thus he asked for a complete reversal of the laissez-faire attitude of the last liberal governments, preserving the economic strength of the British Empire from the destructive competition of Germany. In this sense, he continued to believe that a scientific tariff could still represent the best way to deal with the Germans in the post-war era, forcing them to pay a financial indemnity in raw materials and sparing British labour from the power of their exporting industries. However, Mackinder also began to recognize the crucial importance of financial capital for the war effort, accepting the sale of war obligations on the New York stock market and campaigning in favor of lower taxes toward the business community. Indeed, the ability of its members to make money in difficult circumstances represented an asset of inestimable value for the post-war reconstruction of the country, restoring with wisdom and enterprise the numerous industries damaged by the necessities of the conflict. Of course, this new attitude did not mean a complete revaluation of the cosmopolitan money power of the City of London, excessively open to the dangerous fluctuations of foreign international trade, and Mackinder also distrusted the honesty and transparency of American financial investors, warning the government to remain in close communication with the British statesmen for its New York operations and to take additional precautions against local speculators. Nevertheless, he acknowledged the need of proper national finances for a victorious prosecution of the war, involving the entire population in the task and creating a new kind of solidarity between the different classes of British society. He said, he wrote to the Times in October 1915, "This is the golden opportunity of realizing a true democracy in this country. By saving and lending to the state, the relatively poor may win a new degree of independence, and as a class may count for more than otherwise in the social reconstruction after the war. The obliteration to some extent of the deplorable sharpness of line between labor and capital is a splendid ideal, which may well lighten the often sordid duty of saving. It is the counterpart of our fighting ideal which aims at the destruction of militarism. Let us build our nation anew in the environment which will ensue from the war." Indeed, the war was a great social teacher, clearing away all conventions and forcing people down to the main facts of resistance. It cancelled, for example, the previous division between tariff reformers and free traders, pushing the country to a new comprehensive economic policy. He wrote again, "Economic thought, cleared of fallacy, can be seen now in its simplicity as never in peacetime. Now or never, when all are united in an effort which suppresses minor contentions, and with the chance of clarifying the national mind, so that protectionists and free traders, individualists and socialists will all alike in the future have to appeal to a public from whose eyes the scales have fallen." Thus, it was according to this ideal spirit of unity and solidarity that Mackinder partially modified his previous economic convictions, acquiescing to the preservation of some measures of classical liberalism. After all, victory over Prussian methods was the first aim of Britain at the present time, leaving the final settlement of previous contentions to the new conditions produced by the war. But in certain respects it was necessary to reshape the foundations of the British national structure, preparing them to meet the tremendous difficulties and crises coming at the end of the European hostilities. This was especially crucial in the imperial context, where the persistence of old orthodoxies did not allow the full valorization of human and natural resources for the war effort. Referring to the dominions, for example, Mackinder asked for a more organic relationship between them and the mother country, recognizing their sacrifices in the common fight against the Central Powers and building up a united front for the future peace settlement. This was not mere wishful thinking, but the best way to deal with the future results of the conflict, destined to produce a unique psychological moment in the life of the British imperial system. He declared emphatically in July 1915, "Earths will be steered as they are not commonly steered, and they will be impressionable to a degree to which they are not commonly impressionable, and it will be possible to achieve things in that moment if you do not let the opportunity pass, which it may never be possible to achieve subsequently. It is essential at the end of this war that we should not be tactless, however right we may wish to be in our dealings with the other portions of the empire. But he remained quite vague on the means to reach such an ambitious aim, postponing the definitive settlement of the matter to the post-war era. Indeed, as he plainly recognized in a public lecture at Glasgow University, the future territorial and political settlement of Europe was of more urgent and practical importance than any other issues, requiring a decisive British commitment to guarantee peace among the reshaped national states of the continent. He considered the imperialist isolation pursued after the Napoleonic Wars as a terrible mistake, paving the way to the present international catastrophe. He said to his Glasgow audience, "Let us never forget that a century ago a terrible war, of longer duration than we hope this war will be, came to an end, that the strongest powers, the conquerors in that war, were this country and Russia, yet the brains which made the new map of Europe were neither Russia nor British, but the brains of the Frenchman Talleyrand and the Austrian Metternich. Let us beware that the like thing does not happen again." Thus Britain had to take its share of the responsibilities in the reconstruction of Europe after the conflict, providing that international stability necessary to the safety of the empire in the wider world. This was somehow quite different from the conviction of other imperialists like Leo Emery, Lionel Curtis, who remained skeptical or suspicious toward European affairs, preferring to build a self-referential British world isolated from the danger of continental troubles. In spite of his own imperialist fate, Mackinder did not follow a strict isolationist view of Britain's global power, cooperating extensively with various political organizations for the creation of a more democratic and stable European order. However, this new interest toward Europe does not mean that Mackinder completely forgot imperial affairs during the war years. On the contrary, he shifted mainly his intellectual and political focus on the role of the West African dependencies for the development of the British economy after the conflict, urging the government to reject ordinary free trade theories and to adopt strong protectionist measures in those areas. He declared emphatically in the summer of 1916, "Those regions of West Africa ought to be treated as an asset of the empire. Our duty is to develop those vast regions, and a portion of the results we are entitled to take for ourselves and for civilized mankind, for the civilized mankind which in the course of some generations probably the people who inhabit those regions will be able to join. We are entitled to take it, because we have fought and spent that which cannot be estimated in cash and that ought to be taken into your economics. It has cost us the lives of our men, and we have spent millions on our fleet and on those great forces which in various portions of the empire are called upon to defend our possessions. Indeed, those uncivilized territories were literally imperial estates, ready to be exploited for the good of British citizens who had fought and died on the European fronts to maintain the peace and administration of the Niger Basin. Therefore, Britain was entitled to a considerable proportion of the prosperity of that land, using it to cover the cost of the benefits brought by the Pax Britannica to the local population. Mackinder insisted that his claim did not represent a form of abuse against the natives, but it was instead completely justified as a long-term investment toward their future welfare, developing the rich economic resources of their territories for the advantage of the entire world. However, this was clearly a mere lip service to the humanitarian sensitivity of British public opinion, designed to conceal the real purpose of this economic scheme, the exploitation of West African resources for the successful continuation of the war effort and for the cleaning up of the massive national debt generated by the conflict. Indeed, Mackinder's parliamentary statements were part of the informal campaign led by the Empire Resources Development Committee, or ERDC in abbreviated form, to widen the economic base of the empire in order to protect British living standards from domestic taxation and financial instability. Inspired by the economics of siege provoked by the war and nurtured by the imperialist ideas of Cecil Rhodes, the group was an adaptation of the old tariff reform movement to the new international circumstances, including with Mackinder other prominent antebellum protectionists like Selborne, Milner, Sir Leonard Starr Jameson, and Moreton Freeman. As declared to the press, the main objectives of the ERDC were the conservation for the benefit of the empire of all the natural resources under the ownership or control of imperial institutions, the development of these resources in favor of the British state, and the appointment in due time of a board for the conservation and development of the resources of the empire, for the common good of all British subjects. On his part, Henry Winslow Fox, the leader of the group since its foundation in October 1916, remarked the positive social purpose of the committee, which aimed to reduce class animosities and propels Britain to the future in a new spirit of cooperation and endeavour, making the empire a better place to live in, and giving to many of its citizens new improving conditions of health and material comfort, created by a new and clearly defined state policy in relation to social, economic, and imperial matters. Of course, this could be achieved only through the replacement of the old pernicious doctrine of laissez-faire with a higher command in the field of production, able to encourage and protect national economic activities from external competition. At the same time, the empire should be united through a system of tariff and export duties. Tariff was always a fixation of these people, supported by common diplomatic authorities and improved communications. In this broad scheme of imperial development, native peoples in the tropical dependencies should then be trained and employed at the highest capacity for the full benefit of the new British economic system, subjected to the constant rise of the European population both in Britain and in the Dominions. Thus, new men and new leaders were needed on the political and economic stage, with new conceptions of British imperial responsibilities and with the courage and determination required to discharge them. It was probably this call to arms that attracted Mackinder to the group, participating to its first meetings in the autumn of 1916. He also shared the same constructive imperialism of Wilson Fox, believing that the nationalization of economic activities in the empire could help Britain to win the war and to reshape its vast global colonies into a more efficient and integrated system. However, his choice did not pay in the long term. Indeed, the ERDC became quickly involved in a violent controversy with the Colonial Office and the Anti-Slavery Society over the control of the Nigerian palm oil industry, suffering an indelible damage of credibility in the eyes of the press and the political establishment. Supported by West African merchants who feared to lose their trade to some form of governmental monopoly, the Anti-Slavery Society waged a relentless public campaign against the group's proposals for a state regulation of the business, denouncing loudly the conflict of interest of several members of the committee, more or less involved with private firms active in the Niger region. At the same time, John H. Harris, the respected spokesman of the society, remarked all the dangerous contradictions of the RDC's program, ventilating even their introduction of forced labor with all its attendant horrors in British African colonies. On the other hand, colonial officials were skeptical or hostile toward the constructive policy advocated by the ERDC, fearing the further destabilization of Nigeria and the Gold Coast, suffering already violent forms of internal unrest since the beginning of the war. Some of them also doubted the economic feasibility of the committee's proposals, remembering the disastrous results of the monopoly established by the British South Africa Company in Rhodesia. And of course the fact that Sir Leonard Starr Jameson and other members of the committee were also former executives of the the British South Africa Company was definitely not a good element for the public reputation. Certainly their militance in Rhodes Company reinforced the general doubts about the activities and the proposals of the group. And of course, all the attempts made by Wilson Fox to dispel these views failed to convince his opponents, while they certainly embarrassed the ministerial supporters of the group, exposing the complete lack of coordination between imperial visionaries and public authorities. Thus, with a poor controversial reputation behind them, none of the committee's proposals were able to impress the British government, apart that for the establishment of an Imperial Development Board at the end of the conflict. But this was certainly not what the various group members had hoped to achieve through their lobbyist action. Indeed, as well remarked by Stephen Constantine, the infantile labors of these imperial enthusiasts during the war gave birth to a mouse, showing the resistance of all liberal attitudes against the protectionist pressures of the time. The constructive policies of tariff reform had failed even in wartime, and they were not destined to regain the political spotlight until the economic depression of the late 1920s. On his part, Mackinder had already estranged himself from the group, at least unofficially, since the Nigerian parliamentary debate of November 1916. This tense confrontation in the Commons and the future disposal of German properties in the Niger region, confiscated by British authorities at the start of the war, represented the apex of the rising conflict between the different segments of the Asquith coalition government, nurtured also by the gloomy military perspectives on the Western Front. At the same time, the discussion on these African properties also became a dramatic clash between Andrew Bonar Law, the Conservative leader, and Sir Edward Carson for the leadership of the Conservative Party, revealing the persistence of pre-war political and economic fractures within Tory ranks. Indeed, Carson appealed to Milnerites and tariff reformers to give these enemy resources to British companies, creating a de facto monopoly in the region sustaining the national war effort, while Bonar Law advocated instead their sale to neutral buyers, providing liquidity for the exhausted reserves of the Treasury. Surprisingly, Mackinder, Arthur Steele Maitland, and other tariff reformers agreed with this laissez-faire position, contributing to the final rejection of Carson's proposal to Westminster. In his parliamentary speech, Mackinder illustrated the rationale of his position, defending it from the outraged attacks of their conservative colleagues. He said, "What will be the great want of this country and this empire at the end of this war? Capital. Where are you going to get this capital? Not from the enemy countries. I am afraid not within the British Empire and defending countries, within the countries of our allies. You will find they are as hungry for capital as we are ourselves. Where is the great reservoir of capital? Surely in those very neutral countries, the United States, Holland, Denmark, Norway, which have not been fighting in this war and which have been amassing profits. Are you going to say you will refuse to allow them to invest within your empire, and with the security which comes from the power of purchasing property? Are you going to say you deny that, when the result will be to give the very employment which is essential to the future of this country?" Thus, the partial adoption of free trade measures in the tropical dependencies was not, in his opinion, a betrayal of tariff reform principles, but instead a better application of them, using foreign capital to develop imperial resources. After all, Britain had not the ability to control the Nigerian palm oil industry at the moment, due to the heavy economic burden of the war. The only viable solution was then to invite foreign investors in West Africa, providing the capital and experience necessary to cultivate the market in favor of British power. He said again during the parliamentary debate of 1916, "The result of this sale will be either, on the one hand, that these firms out of their great profits will be compelled to give an adequate price, or on the other hand, the property will be bought by the Dutch, possibly by Americans, but under your policy you will compel those Dutch and Americans to come and manufacture here in the British Empire. What does it matter whether it is Dutch or American capital, if that is the case?" Needless to say, Wilson Fox was not enthusiastic by such an argument, denouncing it as deplorable and insisting on the need of direct government action in Nigeria, taking charge of enemy properties for the great benefit of imperial interests. But Mackinder restated his previous decision, arguing with a certain note of irritation that it would have been superfluous to discuss the matter further. He had already exposed his reasons both in Parliament and in the press, showing even the limited and particular nature of German properties in the region not very suitable for direct government control. He also remarked that the British government should not be a retail competitor in West Africa, leaving enough space to private initiative. Indeed, that measure could provide valuable funds for the indemnification of British interests in the region, restoring the old economic balance disrupted by the war. This practical attitude, based on caution and flexibility, was almost heresy for imperial patriots like F.H. Booth, who accused Mackinder of being a past tariff reformer, having betrayed the protectionist beliefs of his previous political career. He certainly estranged him from the other members of the RDC, but he was now probably less interested in their activities than before due to the constant controversy and scandals surrounding the group's proposals. This does not mean, however, that he dismissed completely their ideas after the war. His name, for example, still appeared in the list of signatures of a memorandum sent by Wilson Fox to the Treasury in June 1919, asking for the appointment of a select committee focused on the development of the natural resources and opportunities of the empire in the tropical world. And some years later, Mackinder also suggested the possibility of implanting a row of white aristocracies amid the native population of East Africa, upholding a standard for civilization of those lands and securing the rich natural resources for the benefits of the British economy. However, the Kamlaki MP thought that the war had temporarily put imperial questions in the background, leaving instead the main stage of the situation of Europe, torn apart by the extreme violence of the conflict. Indeed, it was there that the great military struggle was compelling Britain and the dominions to their utmost physical and economic effort, wasting energies and resources in a dramatic battle of materials. And it was again there that the future world order would have been rebuilt at the end of the conflict, creating new nations and redrawing secular borders through modern geographical methods. But Mackinder was skeptical on the preparedness of British statesmen to deal with such tremendous tasks, due to their insular and more or less detached point of view. At the same time, the general state of geography in the country was still deplorable, made up of scientific generalization without any respect for the real complexity of human geography. On the contrary, it was necessary to give people a sense of proportion and perspective in time and space, giving them a useful help in the practical conduct of international affairs. Therefore, the struggle for Europe presented the most interesting and valuable opportunities for his political and intellectual skills, ready to serve the democratic crusade of the Allies against the autocratic ambitions of the certain powers. The skills were mainly employed in activities of three different groups, all connected by a similar liberal internationalist afflatus: the New Europe, the Serbian Society, and the British Parliamentary Committee. The first two groups were the product of the organizational talent of Robert Seton-Watson, here on the left, I'm sorry for the poor quality of the picture, but it was the only decent that I found of him. I was luckier with Thomas Masaryk here on the right. Anyway, these groups were the product of the organizational talent of Robert Seton-Watson, a journalist and historian expert of South Central European affairs who began to campaign since the outbreak of the war for the emancipation of Slavic peoples from the control of Austria-Hungary. Educated at Oxford, Berlin, Paris, and Vienna, Seton-Watson had been a great supporter of the Habsburg Empire before the conflict, believing that an Austria rejuvenated by universal suffrage could become one of the strongest and most democratic states of the continent, balancing the conflicting interests of Germany and Russia. But the growing authoritarian methods used by Austro-Hungarian authorities towards Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes convinced him of the necessity of dismantling the dual monarchy, creating a free Great Serbian state in the Balkans, capable to resist the advance of Germany toward the Near East. Indeed, he saw the war as the product of the German desire for an autocratic empire in Central Europe, supported by the open connivance of Turks and Hungarians. Therefore, it was imperative to support Serbia and the other Balkan peoples in their fight for independence, recognizing the democratic nature of their cause. He wrote in 1916, "Serbia's aim is not conquest or annexation, it is the liberation and unification of her Serbs, Croats and Slovenes in a single state, the new Yugoslavia. She asks nothing better than that her kinsmen should be free to make their own decision, for she knows that on their part there will be no hesitation." The strong liberal idealism, sometimes reminiscent of Gladstone's first campaign against Turkish despotism in the 1870s, was also mixed with a clear geopolitical perception of the importance of Eastern Europe for the security of the British Empire. Indeed, Seton-Watson remarked that a powerful mid-European bloc led by Germany could become a terrible menace for Britain's strategic position in the Near East, putting even the security of Egypt and India at risk. Therefore, both for moral and pragmatic reasons, the freedom of the Slavs was a cardinal requirement of British policy, establishing a strong line of defense before Constantinople, the traditional gate to the east, and securing the final triumph of the principle of nationality across the entire European continent. To realize this crucial agenda, Seton-Watson gave life to a vast and orchestrated propaganda campaign in favor of East European nationalities, helped by prominent Austro-Hungarian dissidents like Thomas Masaryk, the future president of Czechoslovakia, with whom founded the School of Slavonic Studies at the University of London in 1915. The acme of this campaign was the creation of the New Europe, a weekly review of international affairs edited in collaboration with a vast group of influential intellectuals coming from all the countries of the Entente, including Belgium, Romania, and Japan. And here you can see a list of collaborators to the New Europe. Of course, it's not an entire list because there were numerous people who contributed to the New Europe during the war years. We may say that this is a list with the most important contributors and a list representing all the main allied nations involved in the war and the main personalities of this nation and their contribution to the New Europe program. As I said, the New Europe was founded under the slogan "Pour la Victoire Intégrale", and it subscribed to the official program exposed by Seton-Watson in the first editorial of the magazine, aimed to help towards the formation of a sane and well-informed body of public opinion over European affairs, and to provide a rallying ground for all those involved in the reconstruction of the international system upon a basis of nationality and the rights of minorities, the sole guarantees against the repetitions of the horrors of the present conflict. Indeed, only this kind of democratic approach could achieve an integral victory over the pan-German project of Central Europe and Berlin-Baghdad, securing to Europe permanent peace and the full vindication of the natural rights of smaller nationalities. These revolutionary plans were merely considered as weird fantasies by the British government, who tried instead to negotiate a separate peace with Austria-Hungary for the most part of the conflict, accepting its dismemberment only after the sudden collapse of the Eastern Front in 1917. But the genuine devotion of Seton-Watson and his collaborators played an important role in the development of the international idealism later animating the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, with the birth of the League of Nations and the establishment of the mandate system in Africa and the Middle East. On his part, Mackinder collaborated actively to the New Europe, expressing also his opinion on the program of the magazine in parliamentary and press interventions. He had already shown a certain interest toward the Balkans in 1908 at the time of the Bosnian crisis, considering them as the central region between Europe and Asia, destined to be in the future the seat of conflict of the entire European continent due to its general condition of unstable equilibrium with warring intermixed people and no dominant nationality. The only way to prevent this violent conflagration was then to develop it commercially, using the railways to build up a center of force neutralizing both internal and external tensions. Of course, with the outbreak of war 6 years later, this peaceful option became almost impossible, and Mackinder began to rethink the problem of Southeast Europe in other terms, underlining the very small significance of present political frontiers in the region. At the same time, he underlined the Austrian desire for a port on the Aegean Sea, and the clash between this desire and the rising brilliance of Serbian nationality on its route, putting the entire survival of the dual monarchy at risk. He wrote in 1915, "Either Vienna must at once strike to secure an outlet for her Balkan ambition, or she must herself suffer dismemberment. If she does not carry the war forward into the enemy country, the map of her own broad lands will speedily be rolled up to the foot of the German arms themselves. Therefore, the Allies should support the creation of a new federal great power in Eastern Europe, reuniting all the different nationalities of the region into a single bloc, capable to resist the Germanic ambitions of the Austro-German alliance." Mackinder hoped with this ambitious scheme to counter the Central European project of Friedrich Neumann, designed to unite Germany and Austria-Hungary in a single continental superstate, creating a vast and powerful Balkan Federation, organized along the American and Australian model, both based on the formal equality of the various members of the constitutional structure. In this sense, he also conceived a successful federation of Eastern Europe as a positive response to the bitter criticism of stout Austrophiles like Noel Buxton, who accused the new Europe of putting British strategic interests at risk, sacrificing the reasonable security of a separate peace with the Habsburg monarchy for an unattractive congeries of small Balkan independent states. This was also the opinion of Lord Milner, who remarked in a public interview that Britain did not go to war for Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, or Romanians, demanding only some arrangements for their autonomy within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This appeared to be the best and cheapest way to defend British imperial interests in the Near East, maintaining a solid barrier against any future German or Russian advance toward the Mediterranean. Mackinder, however, was not quite satisfied by these arguments, remarking the extreme instability of the political and military situation in the East. He said in 1917, what we may have to accept is a peace which is neither German nor non-German, but something between. In the case may be essential, both for the permanent settlement of Europe and for the maintenance of the British Empire, that the Balkan peoples should be helped by us to achieve a certain stability and independence. Thus, Britain's real interest was to express a human note of sympathy and of association toward its Slavic allies, supporting their ideas who had incidentally served its cause so valiantly against German expansionism, preventing the domination of the European continent by a single central power near the shores of the English Channel. This did not mean, however, the partisan favor of one allied nation against the others, maintaining instead a careful balance of power in the Balkan region, especially along the contested Adriatic coast, the subject of violent quarrels between Italy and the Yugoslav movement. On the delicate subject, Mackinder expressed his opinion in very moderate terms. Even in our enthusiasm for the Serbs, he wrote, we must recognize the position of Italy, with a coastline towards the Adriatic without a single port that can harbor a modern fleet. We have therefore to balance the legitimate needs of our Italian ally in this matter, not merely with our general impulse to create a great Serbia, but with the vital European necessity of creating a great Serbia, having a main exit to the Aegean, although no doubt also minor exits to the Adriatic, and compatibility with this we must put the minimum possible Slav population under Italian rule. And the same was true for the control of the Aegean Sea, which was at the core of Greek intervention in the war on the side of the Entente after several months of ambiguous neutrality. Indeed, Venizelos, the Greek leader with the eye of a geographer and a statesman, had successfully established his country on the side of the Allies, providing French and British forces at Salonika with a great strategic opportunity against Austro-German forces in the Balkan Peninsula. Mackinder attached great importance to this event, which definitely closed the road of the Near East to the Central Powers, and insisted on the necessity of keeping British troops in the malarious hills of Macedonia, fending any threat against precious Greek harbors and rendering a vital service both to the Empire and to the freedom of Europe. These military and diplomatic considerations found a certain resonance in the writing activities of the Serbian Society, the group created by Seton-Watson in support of Serbia in the autumn of 1916. Some months later, for example, the Society, composed by influential personalities like Romer, Bryce, and H.M. Inman, sent a short memorandum to the Lloyd George government where they suggested a complete reorganization of the Allied army based on Salonika, taking full advantage of the new circumstances created by the Greek intervention. After the final exit of Russia from the war in 1918, these ideas were reiterated again in another letter to the Prime Minister, stressing the pivotal importance of a stronger effort of the Allies in favor of the friendly subject peoples of Austria-Hungary, without any further diplomatic approach toward the Austrian government. Meanwhile, Seton-Watson Group created a joint committee with other similar associations, for example the British-Italian League, the Anglo-Romanian Society, the Anglo-Hellenic Society, to concert their common efforts in favor of a more stable and democratic organization of the Balkan region after the conflict. Mackinder was elected chairman of the new organization, and he met at regular intervals with other distinct academics like Ronald Barrows and Arthur Evans to elaborate a viable compromise between the various competing nationalities of Southeast Europe. His interest over the cause of those peoples was not only dictated by geopolitical strategic reasons. At the same time, he also felt that the old popular philosophy of vast continental empires, so influential in antebellum era, had been seriously challenged by the events of the war. He asked himself publicly in 1915, as the day of great Kaiserdoms pass, may it be that when the war comes to be measured in historical perspective, its chief decision will be held to have been as between imperial centralization and clustered nationalities. In other words, will the terrestrial globe in the future reflect the celestial globe and exhibit only constellations of minor nationalities? Indeed, the heroic resistance of Belgium and Serbia against the pretensions of the German empires, the internal disintegration of Russia after the February Revolution, the entry of the United States into the conflict with its ideas of national self-determination, the continuous grievances of India and the dominions toward the conduct of the British war effort represented together a clear rejection of the cultural mindset of the pre-war period, based on ideas of organic unity and the struggle for resistance between close political systems, requiring instead a new pluralistic approach to the future reconstruction of the international order torn apart by the conflict. Might was no more right, as well put by Thomas Masaryk in his inaugural address at the London School of Slavonic Studies. And these democratic notions, in Masaryk's words, were no mere pipe dreams, because the spiritual and moral forces in society were not less real than the German intellectuals who had converted anthropology into zoology, justifying their aggressive ambitions under the cover of Darwin's natural theories. Now, even an ardent social Darwinist like Benjamin Kidd shared such a kind of political idealism, denouncing his previous association with the sense of power that glorified war, nationalism, and eugenics in Edwardian Britain, and embracing again the Christian values of his young upbringing. Still involved in imperialist initiatives like those of the RDC, Mackinder remained quite skeptical of the possibility of a post-war organization of international relations around the liberal principles, expressing later his doubts on the matter in Democratic Ideals and Reality, written as a sort of response to the democratic doctrines presented by Woodrow Wilson at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. Indeed, he worded the dream of an unceasing peace as championed by supporters of the American president was an illusion, because international tension was destined to accumulate again due to the natural unequal growth of nations. But the influence of Masaryk and Seton-Watson, coupled with the devastating prolongation of the conflict in Europe, detached him from the group determinism of pre-war political philosophy, leaving space to a renovated hope in the constructive and positive power of human beings. He wrote in Democratic Ideas and Reality, "If we are to realize our ideal of a League of Nations which shall prevent war in the future, we must recognize geographical realities and take steps to counter their influence. Last century, under the spell of the Darwinian theory, men came to think that those forms of organization should survive which adapted themselves best to their natural environment. Today we realize, as we emerge from our fairy trial, that human victory consists in our rising superior to such mere fatalism. Therefore it was necessary to establish a world power sufficiently able to keep the law between small and great states without growing into a world tyranny, based on the violent conquest of other countries or on the perversion of international laws." And Mackinder taught that such a power did not reside in the abstract legalism of the League of Nations, but instead in the commonality of interests and values between the allied powers, united into a single democratic Western bloc. He matured this original idea during his activities with the British Parliamentary Committee, a selected group of MPs led by James Bryce, who remained in close contact with the parliamentary institutions of other allied countries, organizing periodical foreign visits and public meetings to support a better political coordination between the two powers. As the secretary of the association, Mackinder visited both France and Italy during the war, directly experiencing the terrible destruction of the local fronts and acquiring a precious knowledge of the necessities of these countries in the post-war era. In France, for example, he was shocked by the systematic destruction brought by the German army in the northern districts of the country, including the deportation of local civilians and the purposeful ravage of agricultural resources. In spite of this deliberate destruction, however, Mackinder was struck by the silent and self-possessed spirit of French soldiers, ready to fight until the final defeat of the Hun. Some months later, visiting the trenches along the Isonzo River, he also had similar expressions of admiration for the Italian army, fighting the ostensibly terrible environment conditions. He wrote to the Observer in 1917. No one who has seen what we then saw, but must salute the soldiers of the main Italian armies as heroes. I can only affirm my conviction, as firm as before the disaster of Caporetto, that the young soldier of Italy is the material of a great nation in every way worthy of the lives beside which it stands in this war. This heroism was even more remarkable in his eyes, considering the peculiar conditions of the country, relying mainly on its magnificent industrial manpower and depending to some extent on the economic assistance of its allies. Therefore, considering all these sacrifices in the name of the Allied cause, Britain should approach its European neighbors with a different attitude after the war, establishing closer political ties with them and giving even some preferential treatment to their commercial enterprises. Speaking in front of the Allied parliaments at the Sorbonne, Mackinder elaborated in more detail his thoughts on the argument, remarking the need of a common institution allowing the continuation of inter-Allied cooperation in the future times of peace. Indeed, the war had impressed a dramatic transformation of the historical development of the world, symbolized by the capital events of the Russian Revolution and the American intervention into the conflict. These events meant the certain victory of democracy over autocracy, requiring a different reorganization of the international system after the end of the conflict. Thus, united by the main consequences of these facts, Britain, Italy, and France had become sisters, living in the same house, guarding the same western oceans, and facing the same enemy from the Orient. They should not separate after the war, completing each other into a vast defensive unit from Scotland to Sicily, connected through big futuristic tunnels under the Channel and the Alps. At the same time, on the model of the ancient Republic of Venice, they represented the impregnable citadel of liberty, based and regulated by those unique parliamentary institutions created by all three countries into a common historical effort. Therefore, these democratic customs, united into a single political and economic space, represented the best response to the autocratic idea of Middle Europa, giving a long-lasting Roman peace to all the peoples of Europe. Mackinder's political proposal was sincerely appreciated at the time. In Europe, for example, they find the Sorbonne speech as admirable, while some of its main statements were meshed up in an official declaration of the Allied parliaments, where the various delegates of the three countries expressed with absolute unanimity the desire to implement the unification of the allies in the diplomatic and military sphere, refusing any sort of peace without the triumph of liberty and law in the world. However, colonial rivalries and economic competition were destined to destroy later the strong pan-European sentiment at the peace table, preparing the ground for another bloody and violent world war. Nevertheless, in the early 1920s, Mackinder remembered with genuine satisfaction his service with the British Parliamentary Committee, paying with his French colleague Henri Franklin-Bouillon a short but moving tribute to the liberal idealism of the late Lord Bryce, who had been the main force behind the successful work of the peculiar form of international organization. Indeed, both men defined Bryce as a great European, using a very interesting choice of terms and betraying some sort of pan-European sensibility to a certain extent. And inspired by the influential example of Bryce, Mackinder supported a pragmatic settlement of the Ruhr crisis in 1923, asking his countrymen to sympathize both with the French and with the Germans as an effective way of restoring economic and political stability in Western Europe. 2 years later, with the formal signature of the Locarno Treaties, Mackinder finally saw realized his wartime aspirations of a safe and stable European order, which promoted the building of the Rhine Bridge between Paris and Berlin, supporting actively the internationalist principles championed by the League of Nations. He said in that occasion, "It is our hope that this regional compact will rebuild Europe with Geneva and The Hague as Rhine centers, and we have made Britain, as co-guarantor of the Rhine frontier, an essential element in the European system. Thus we look again with some confidence to the future of international relations, rejoicing with all good Europeans to the definite conclusions of the great cataclysm started in 1914. In this sense, Mackinder considered the Great War as an important turning point for the future of humanity, exposing all the risks of a closed and locked international system dominated by jealous great powers armed to the teeth with modern weapons of mass destruction. Indeed, he saw that unprecedented conflict as something affecting the entire world, with few shelters and no refugees left on either for fugitive individuals or for neutral nations. He wrote on the Glasgow Herald in August 1917, in commemoration of the 3rd anniversary of the outbreak of the war, "We have carried our railways from shore to shore on every continent. We have our submarines in the water and our airplanes in the air. By wireless telegraphy we have truly annihilated both space and time. We have bumped against poor limits. No shock can be given to our organization, but it is propagated like a wave through the air from some great volcanic eruption, and, meeting in the antipodes, it returns to us reflected in a counter-shock. The struggle for existence is stark and cruel. Thus it was necessary, in his opinion, to kill the devil of war as soon as possible, before the advance of material science made the venom in his tail more dangerous and deadly than ever. He wrote again, "Today is the chance of civilization. The world is larger than it ever was, for the resources of civilization now reach into its remotest corners, and into its heights and into its depths. But it is also smaller than it ever was, for the will of one Kaiser can afflict it everywhere at once. We are no longer open to invasion from an unknown without. The dangers for peace will be from within henceforth. The next great advance of man must be moral and spiritual, in command over himself rather than over nature." And it was for this chief reason they championed the cause of a free, united Europe like that officially designed at Locarno, based on common democratic ideas and permanent diplomatic bonds. After all, it was a great idea, a consoling idea, to think that British and Allied soldiers had not died in larger numbers only to preserve the selfish interests of their own countries, but also to organize, for the first time, a world democratic world, really civilized and hopefully happy. Thank you.